Hello and welcome back to another CS 199 EMP session. Sorry, we're a little bit behind schedule, but I'll try to keep you here. Try not to keep you for very long. Okay. So today's topics, we're going to be covering objects, constructors, encapsulation, and we're talking a little bit about Java compilation and execution. So as always, you can find the slides on the course website, netify.app. And then you can find, you can do any of the code on the homepage or on the playground for the site. Okay, so last time I think we did quite a bit about objects and classes and instances. There was like at least 2 practice problems on this. But let's quickly review. So objects are usually just like the bundle of the data and the code. You remember that? You guys remember that? The variable and the function names, yeah, I would remember it as kind of those 2 things combined together that define how something should behave. So string name and int age are 2 data points for an object person. And then a class is kind of the factory that creates an object. You can think of it that way, or the blueprint that kind of says this is what the state and the behaviors of the object are, or a class car, or any other kind of class. And then instance is like the occurrence of that class. Sometimes we'll use instance and object interchangeably because one specific object is an instance of a class. Okay, so right, so objects are tied to object-oriented programming, which is kind of just a specific way of programming that's all about objects. So it's a different way of thinking, I guess, but it's kind of very often seen in programming. Yeah. So our first practice will be with objects. And this one, we're allowing you a lot of creativity to do whatever you guys want to do. So you'll be defining an object or a class called enemy. And then the enemy should have name, a health points, loot, and weapon. And you can have other variables too, it's up to you. But it should have those 4 things. And then it should also be able to attack, die, and heal. So we've loosely defined what these are. So you can choose what data type they are, but think about it in the most logical way and think about what data type a name would be, what data types health points would be, etc. And then you should also think about what you want these different actions to do. We're not giving you a whole lot of instruction there. It's just kind of up to you, but the general idea should be if you get attacked, if you die, then your health points go to 0. If you heal, your health points go up, that kind of idea. If you get attacked, then maybe you say something or you print something out. So yeah, we'll work on that for 10 minutes and we'll regroup. So at 6:19. And just let me know in the chat if you finish earlier than that. Sorry, I forgot that there was some starter code. Yes, this is the starter code for the enemy class. Okay, so it looks like Andrew, you're done, and yeah, this looks right. You're printing out. Okay, yeah. Yeah, this looks correct. So let's just walk through this again. Okay, so yeah, like you have in yours, you're gonna need a string name and one of your data types. You're gonna need an int. I think you have an int just for that, right? Yeah, int for health points. And you're gonna need a string for the web and string for loot. So these are the four things we had asked for. But if you had others or if you changed the name up, something like that, that's fine. So for void attack, what you could have done is you could have just printed out something. I don't know if this is what you have to print out. Uh, Print out name plus attack with a plus weapon. So that's one thing you could have had in it. You could have designed it however you wanted, really. With dying, I think you'd want to reset your health points to 0, probably. And then maybe you would print out something like system attachment given name plus size. And maybe you would give your loot over to the person who killed you, or then maybe return loot, just as an example. Let me see what you did in yours. Yeah, so you just printed out died, which is fine. I wouldn't specify what we did. But the idea here is that you know how to create a class without doing any looking up anything. You just know how structure is, and you know what needs to be void, what needs to be returning something, to understand the structure of the different data variables and how they can be used in these functions. Yeah. Cool. Put in a return there and just return nothing. Those void examples. Points. Oh, I named it. Oh, oops. Yeah, super heal, you might increase the health points by 10. Oh gosh. Okay, so that would everything seems to have worked. If you use the starter code, to print out these things. Yeah, and so I'm just looking at this now and I realize that in the starter code we defined that die should return something called loot. So yeah, you do need to return loot in order for this to work properly. Yeah, so pretty straightforward, I think. Yeah, let's just move on to the next question. If there are any questions, let me know. They didn't make sense. Okay, so the next piece of it is constructors, which we've also learned At this point, they're just functions that allow you to create a new instance of an object without using all of these initializations here. They're just an easier way to do all of this assignment in kind of one line. And you've set it up so that anytime you use it, you create kind of another instance with different kinds of variables initialized. And remember that you can overload constructors, meaning you can have more than one constructor for a specific class, and it can take in different inputs and initialize different data variables. So you can have one that looks like this. You can have one that just initializes the name and just initializes the health points. Yeah, so one class can have multiple constructors, and we'll see how we can use that in a second. Any questions before I move on to the practice problem? Cool. Okay, so here's the first problem. You're just going to create a constructor for the same enemy class that you designed before, but it forces the user to initialize the name, the health points, the weapon, and the loot. So all 4 of these should be initialized in the constructor. That should be one constructor, and then overload the constructor by adding a new one that only initializes the name of the enemy. So that's 2 constructors, one that initializes all of these things and one that initializes just the names. Yeah, so that will be the next. We'll do 5 minutes for that one. If you need more time, you can adjust accordingly. Let's regroup at 6:30. Okay, yeah, that's all right. So the point of overloading the constructor is just so that you have another way of initializing certain variables. So in this particular case, it's not really clear, but it'll become clear to you later on when you're working on more advanced examples of classes. In those cases, having more than one overloaded constructor kind of creates objects that have some data points that are not initialized and some that are initialized, and they'll be handy for you. Um, they'll just be handy for you like in certain situations. I can't really think of any that are all good off the top of my head, and I don't know that it's certainly good for the enemy class, but they do have their advantages in some kind of specific situations. I hope that answers your question about overloading the constructor. And I think your code looks correct for the enemy class. Yeah, your code for the enemy class looks pretty spot on. With the constructors at least. So they're pretty straightforward, I think. Not super enemy. You're taking a string, set name, then set help, and string weapon, string set weapon. And string set loot. Okay, and then you want to just set the name equal to the name. So just to be clear, you're setting the instance variable name and you're setting it to be equal to set name, which is what the constructor takes in. So you're passing in something into set name and that gets initialized as that name gets initialized with that value. Health points is equal to set health and set weapon, sorry, weapon is equal to set weapon and loot is equal to set loot. Yeah, that's the first constructor. So, yeah, so we, oops. I'm just gonna comment this out. So the reason why it's giving me an error is it's expecting an empty constructor, but I haven't defined an empty constructor up here. So if I just do enemy, yeah, I don't even need to do that. Just need to do this. Gosh, and then it should allow me to use an empty constructor. So once you create one constructor, this empty constructor needs to be explicitly defined in order for you to call an empty constructor. The empty constructor is just a constructor which doesn't take anything in. It's just kind of a plain, good old-fashioned constructor that's implied if you don't have any constructors. Enemy, and so the last one that we asked for was enemy. Oops. And then let's take a name, string set name, needs name, something. Okay. So those are the constructors. Any questions on that? Great. Then we'll move on to encapsulation, the fancy kind of way to basically say the user needs to interact with what they actually need to interact with. Don't give the user too much ability to interact with every single thing in a class. And that's just because classes can hold information that you don't want the user to see, like passwords. It can be things about other users. It could be things about your system that you don't want them to know. So it's very important that we define access or visibility modifiers, however you like to call them. And you can set them to be private or public, and then based off of that, users are not able to access certain things inside of a method, not a method, inside of a class, and then they are able to access other things inside of a class. So for example, you have the password in this account class. You wouldn't want a regular old user to be able to access their password like that. You know, you would just be able to print out the password every time they used the Jackie C3 account. Rather, you'd want to make it private so that they can't easily access that. And then username you can maybe leave as public or private depending on the situation. So we're going to be practicing with a playlist class, which is defined right here. You're going to be creating 4 methods. These are the 4 methods for the playlist class, and you're also going to be adding visibility modifiers to these. So you'll need to add visibility modifiers to these 3 things. And then you're going to add these getter and setter methods. So add song should take in a new song and add it to your playlist. And get playlist should return your playlist array. Yeah, and then make sure that when you're adding the song that you increase the number of songs. And then get song by index, you put in the index, use the index to find a particular song inside of your playlist. And make sure you try to think about that situation where someone passes in an index that is greater than the number of indices you have in playlist. So what do you do in that case? And what should it return? And then finally, you're going to write the set name, which just sets the name of the playlist, the string name. So fairly straightforward, I think. Main key here is figuring out what you would want to set these 3 things to be. So once you set something to be private inside of a class, the only way you can access those things is using getter and setter methods. So you can't directly access them using like the dot notation. You can use like get playlist, you can get song, get set name. You can only access them using these kinds of getter and setter methods. And that's just because that way we as programmers can define how the user will interact with these different data points. They're not willy-nilly changing things as they wish, but we say, oh, you can, if you want to change the playlist, you can do it, but you just have to call this function. And so we can say, oh, if you want to change the playlist to XYZ, we can define that in our setter method. Okay, so 10 minutes for this one. Let me know if you have questions. Let me know when you finish. Oh, chat. Yeah, so you can, operate without it, but the main thing is like you'd want to hide that capability, right? You don't want users to automatically be able to do every single thing. I guess the best example of that is passwords. For the playlist case, it's not really about security more as much as it is about not letting your users randomly do things to your class or your objects. You're defining what they can do inside of these methods. And beyond this, they can't make any changes to how your class is defined. So encapsulation, really all about like hiding what the underlying structure of your classes is, and only letting your users interact with what you have defined for them to interact with. And you'll see more of this throughout the semester. So yeah, we'll regroup at 6:50. Okay, let's review this section. So I looked at your code. I'm just going to copy and paste it here so I can actually see it better. So playlist name, num songs, private playlist set name. And add songs. Okay. There's going to be some textile errors in here. Let me fix those real quick. Yeah. So it says in line 27, you can't write. So the reason why it's saying that is there's no set name here. So if you're going to set the name, you want to call the argument that you're passing in set name, and then you'd want to set the actual variable name to be set name. Otherwise, I think this looks good. Couple of things to note here. I see that you've made a lot of these private, but the thing is that you'd want to set your variable, like your methods, to not be private, because if they're private, your user can't access them. So someone outside of this class can't use these methods. So I would actually take these private access modifiers out, and I would make them just public, default public. And I would then make these three instance variables private, so that my user can't use dot notation to call playlist name or num strings. Instead, they can only make changes to these things using these methods, like that. And then I'm gonna double check to make sure this logic looks good. So you're setting name to be name here, and then you're setting playlist to be like this. That looks good. And then you have add song, which will, yeah, so here you'd actually want to do, you're going to add a new song to the playlist. You actually want to put playlist on the left-hand side of the equal sign. And then you're going to, num songs is where your last index is. So you'd set it to be this way, and then you'd set song equal to this. Yeah, so you would want to make your playlist private. So in the chat it says that I'm creating my own playlist that I would prefer to make private. So yeah, so your playlist is private the way it's set up right now. But if you wanted to add songs, then you would want to only add songs using the add song method. You don't want other people to randomly be like playlist dot and rewrite some song in your playlist. The way that you have written add song is you add a song to the end of the list. Okay, so you've defined what add song should do. If playlist was not private, then some user could be like playlist dot zero, like you could access the 0th index of the playlist and reset whatever was in that specific section. So that's why you'd want to make it private, and you would want to make your playlist private, but you wouldn't want to make add song private because you're going to be making additions to your playlist. Yeah, so that's for add song. Yeah, this is how you'd want to write this song. And then you also want to increase the number of songs here. So because now you have one more song, right? So you want to increase that number. And get playlist looks great. Get and by index. So this is good. You're returning the specific song inside of the playlist. But just remember that the index that a user could pass in could be greater than the amount of songs you have in your playlist. So if you have a playlist with 100 things, what if the person passed in 200? Then you'd basically get an error in this case. So what you should do, kind of like make it look a little smoother, is you would want to check if the index that they passed in, if that's less than the number of songs, then maybe you could just like return, yeah, you could just return no song index. And then otherwise you would return playlist because it's a valid index. Other things you could have done, you could have used like an assert statement to assert that A has to be less than number of songs. There's a number of ways you could have handled this, but you want to have some sort of handle mechanism for if the index is too big. And then finally set name, you have that. So yeah, so some smaller mistakes here and there, but you seem to have gotten the general idea. Okay. So lots of discussion about objects. So we only have about 3 minutes left. So we will very quickly talk about Java compilation execution. There isn't a practice problem about this. And you've kind of already covered it in the lesson. But we'll just talk about high level and low level programming languages and what that means. So in general, there is like a hierarchy for programming languages. You've probably heard of Java at this point, but there's things like Kotlin, there's JavaScript, there's C++, C, Python, several different languages, and they each kind of interact with the machine at like different levels. They give you a certain amount of control with machine code. And just to show you what this kind of what I mean is like, this is kind of like a spectrum of the different programming languages. And some programming languages like Java, Python, JavaScript are kind of high-level programming languages in the sense that they're very close to our human natural languages, and they kind of handle a lot of the underlying details of the machine that you're working on. They have their own garbage collectors, and they handle a lot of the memory usability and accessibility for users. And then there are some other programming languages like C and C++ that give the user some of the control over memory management and the hardware aspects of the computer. So C and C++, you're going to see in some of the more difficult classes, the user has more control there and you can make more adjustments, and programming language doesn't handle all of the kind of back-end hardware stuff. And then ultimately there's machine language assembly code. Remember that all of the code that you write eventually gets translated into a series of ones and zeros. And before that, there's the machine language, there's assembly language, which directly talks to the hardware in the computer. And so there is this kind of spectrum out there that we wanted you to be aware of as you're going into this. Java makes your life a lot easier once you get in, if you go into harder classes like 241 and 225, then you're going to see more C, C++, so on and so forth. And you have to think more about the hardware and the machine that you're working on. Anyway, this is not something that you're going to be tested on. It's just kind of like a fun fact. On the poll, a lot of people responded that they would like to see more about compilation and execution, and we thought that Jeff had already done a really good job of talking about that, so we thought we would cover this instead. Yeah, so just something to keep in mind. Yeah, so everything needs to be translated to machine code, and you'll see that more in later classes if you just choose to continue on this path. Okay, so there's one more extra object practice, and since we're kind of over time, I'm not going to go through it, but I'll just maybe talk about it, but I won't go through the solution for it. And it's kind of on Twitter. So the Twitter application that many of you, I presume, are familiar with. What you're going to do is define a Twitter class or a tweet class, I suppose. And it's got some private variables like the body, the username, the date, number of retweets, number of mentions, number of replies, and number of all of the replies to the tweets. You would want to create a constructor for the tweet, and you'd want to have some getter and setter methods that we've mentioned here. And each of those should be like adding a retweet should increase the number of retweets, and adding mentions should increase the number of mentions. So this is something that you can maybe do on your own time for practice. On the next couple of quizzes, you're going to see a lot of classes and objects, so I highly recommend that you spend some time just trying to learn how to do this kind of stuff without looking at any other code, because that's pretty much all you're going to be doing in the future, just objects and classes. So this is starter codes that you guys can use. But yeah, I won't go through this. We have a solutions section in the back that can walk you through it. Any questions? That's it from me today. Yeah, when you scan through. Yeah. Yeah, you don't need it. Yeah, I think Jackie just prefers to use a return afterwards. So if you have a void method, wait, let me go to the solution sections. Your void method, you don't need to have like the return here. You can just, it'll just automatically return. But if you want to, you can. I think Jackie's just style is just to add return whenever possible. Thanks for stopping by. I hope you have a good weekend. Yeah.